From the Gulf War to an unfinished conflict 199-11993. Iraq's crushing defeat in the 1991 Gulf War at the hands of a U.S.-led coalition did not bring closure to the conflict between Washington and Baghdad. Instead, it marked the beginning of a prolonged and deeply unstable post-war period that quietly laid the groundwork for another American invasion more than a decade later. After Iraqi forces were expelled from Kuwait, the international community, led by the United States, chose not to overthrow Saddam Hussein, believing containment was preferable to regime change. The United Nations Security Council soon passed Resolution 687, which formally ended hostilities but imposed strict conditions on Iraq. Baghdad was required to eliminate all chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons programs, dismantle delivery systems such as long-range missiles, and submit to intrusive inspections. These weapons, collectively labeled weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, became the central issue defining Iraq's relationship with the world. Sanctions were imposed to enforce compliance, effectively isolating Iraq economically and militarily. During the war, Iraqi forces had prepared large stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons, creating genuine concern among coalition troops, who trained extensively for chemical warfare. Yet Saddam ultimately chose not to deploy these weapons during the conflict, likely fearing massive retaliation. Despite this restraint, Iraq has passed use of chemical weapons against Iran in the 1980s and against Kurdish civilians ensured that international suspicion remained intense. Inspectors later uncovered evidence of a covert nuclear research effort, further reinforcing fears in Washington. Although some U.S. officials, including President George H.W. Bush, privately considered removing Saddam from power, many allies opposed another war. Instead, Bush sought to stabilize the post-Cold War world through multilateral cooperation, withdrawing most U.S. troops while maintaining limited involvement. No-fly zones were established to protect Kurdish populations in the north and Shiite communities in the south, keeping American and British aircraft engaged over Iraqi airspace. This uneasy balance neither war nor peace defined the early 1990s and ensured that the Iraq problem was far from resolved. Sanctions, inspections, and humanitarian crisis 1993-1998. As the 1990s progressed, Iraq became one of the most heavily sanctioned countries in modern history. The sanctions regime restricted oil exports and limited imports of industrial and medical equipment that could potentially have military applications, while intended to pressure Saddam's government into compliance. The sanctions had devastating effects on Iraqi civilians. Agricultural production collapsed, public health infrastructure deteriorated, and widespread poverty led to malnutrition and disease. Estimates suggested that hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, many of them children, died as a result of these conditions, though the exact figures remain disputed. Critics argue that the Iraqi government manipulated humanitarian suffering for propaganda purposes, while others insist the sanctions themselves were fundamentally flawed. Throughout this period, UN weapons inspectors struggled to verify Iraq's claims that it had destroyed its WMD stockpiles. Cooperation was inconsistent, records were incomplete, and inspectors frequently complained of obstruction and deception. Under President Bill Clinton, the United States adopted a policy of containment, seeking to limit Saddam's power without resorting to full-scale war. The Oil for Food program allowed Iraq to sell limited quantities of oil to purchase humanitarian supplies, slightly easing civilian suffering while maintaining pressure on the regime. Tensions escalated in 1998 when inspectors demanded access to sensitive locations, including presidential sites. Saddam refused, accusing inspectors of spying for American and Israeli intelligence claims that were later partially confirmed. When Iraq expelled the inspectors altogether, the United States and Britain responded with Operation Desert Fox, launching hundreds of airstrikes against suspected weapons facilities. Clinton also signed the Iraq Liberation Act, formally endorsing regime change as U.S. policy and providing support to Iraqi opposition groups. These actions further polarized the international community. Russia, France, and China condemned the strikes, motivated in part by their economic interests in Iraqi oil. Meanwhile, neighboring countries quietly violated sanctions through smuggling. By the end of the decade, Iraq's economy showed signs of recovery, and U.S. intelligence assessments suggested Saddam's grip on power was secure, setting the stage for a dramatic shift after 2001, September 11th, and the transformation of U.S. threat perception 2001-2002. The election of George W. Bush in January 2001 initially signaled continuity rather than change in U.S. foreign policy. His campaign emphasized domestic issues, and Iraq was not an immediate priority. That changed abruptly on September 11, 2001, when coordinated terrorist attacks struck New York and Washington, killing nearly 3,000 people and shattering Americans' sense of security. The attacks, carried out by al-Qaeda under Osama bin Laden, transformed U.S. strategic thinking overnight. Within weeks, American forces invaded Afghanistan to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban government that sheltered it. Yet the Bush administration also began to reassess Iraq through a new lens shaped by fear of catastrophic terrorism. Although no direct evidence linked Saddam Hussein to 9/11's, U.S. officials increasingly argued that Iraq's history with WMDs made it an unacceptable risk in a post-9/11's world. The possibility, however, speculative that Saddam might provide chemical or biological weapons to terrorists, resonated powerfully with a traumatized American public already shaken by anthrax attacks. In January 2002, Bush labeled Iraq part of an axis of evil, alongside Iran and North Korea, accusing it of pursuing weapons of mass destruction and supporting terrorism. While intelligence agencies struggled to establish credible links between Iraq and al-Qaeda, public opinion shifted dramatically. Polls showed growing support for confronting Saddam, and by late 2002, a majority of Americans believed Iraq had assisted in the 9/11 attacks, a belief later shown to be incorrect. Congress authorized the use of force, reflecting bipartisan consensus shaped by fear, uncertainty, and political pressure. In this environment, caution gave way to urgency, and long-standing disputes over Iraq were reinterpreted as imminent threats demanding decisive action. Intelligence failures and the road to war 2002-2003 as momentum for war built. The Bush administration emphasized Iraq's alleged WMD programs as the central justification for invasion. Although European allies shared concerns about Saddam's past behavior, many urged a diplomatic approach through the United Nations. Under intense U.S. pressure, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1441 in November 2002, demanding Iraq's full cooperation with renewed weapons inspections while stopping short of authorizing force. Saddam agreed, allowing inspectors led by Hans Blix and Mohammed el-Baradei to return. Despite extensive searches, inspectors found no evidence of active WMD programs. Yet US intelligence agencies, under immense political and public pressure, interpreted ambiguous data in the most alarming way. Much of the information supporting WMD claims came from Iraqi exiles with strong incentives to exaggerate or fabricate evidence. One key source, known as Curveball, provided detailed but unverified accounts of mobile biological weapons, labs claims later proven false. British intelligence reports alleging Iraqi uranium purchases from Niger were also embraced despite being based on forged documents. Internal dissent within intelligence agencies was overshadowed by senior officials determined to make the case for war. A rival intelligence unit within the Pentagon promoted worst-case interpretations, while public statements were far more certain than classified assessments. On February 5, 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell presented the U.S. case to the UN Security Council, displaying satellite images and intercepted communications that were portrayed as definitive proof. While the presentation convinced much of the American public, many international observers remained unconvinced. Nevertheless, the administration concluded that waiting posed greater risks than acting, and preparations for invasion accelerated. Ideology, oil, and the Bush Doctrine beyond intelligence and security concerns. Broader ideological forces also shaped the decision to invade Iraq. A group of influential policymakers, often described as neoconservatives, figures such as Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz, advocated a more assertive use of American power. They believed U.S. credibility depended on decisive action and argued that multilateral constraints had weakened American influence during the 1990s. Think tanks like the Project for the New American Century promoted the idea that U.S. military dominance was essential for global stability. Some critics argued that 9/11s provided the catalyst needed to implement long-held plans for reshaping the Middle East, including establishing a pro-American government in Iraq. Oil also loomed in the background. Iraq possessed vast reserves, and U.S. dependence on Middle Eastern energy had increased significantly by the early 2000s. While officials denied that oil motivated the invasion, critics contended that controlling access or denying it to rivals such as France, Russia, and China was a strategic consideration. At the same time, Bush articulated a new doctrine of preventive war, arguing that traditional strategies of containment and deterrence were obsolete against rogue states and terrorist networks. According to this logic, the United States had the right to strike potential threats before they fully materialized. This represented a significant shift from post-Cold War norms and alarmed many allies, who feared it undermined international law and collective security. Nonetheless, within the administration, confidence was high that advanced U.S. military technology and Iraqi public resentment toward Saddam would make regime change swift and relatively painless. Iraqi miscalculations and the invasion of 2003, while U.S. decisions were crucial, Iraqi actions also played a decisive role in the march toward war. It is now known that Iraq had destroyed its WMD stockpiles years before 2003. Yet Saddam never convincingly proved this to the international community. Deeply distrustful of UN inspectors whom he believed were tools of US and Israeli intelligence, Saddam adopted a strategy of deliberate ambiguity. He hoped to deter regional rivals such as Iran and Israel by appearing stronger than he actually was. while also believing the United States feared prolonged casualties. This miscalculation proved fatal. Saddam underestimated how profoundly 9/11s had altered American attitudes and overestimated the effectiveness of Cold War-style deterrence. As inspections dragged on without definitive conclusions, President Bush assembled a coalition of the willing, with Britain, Australia, and Poland providing major military support. Despite massive global protests and opposition from key UN members, the administration concluded that time was running out. On March 17, 2003, Bush issued an ultimatum demanding Saddam leave Iraq within 48 hours. He refused. 2 days later, US-led forces launched airstrikes on Baghdad and began the invasion. Rather than prioritizing suspected WMD sites, American forces raced toward the capital, aiming to topple the regime. Saddam's expectation of a popular uprising against the invaders never materialized. His sons Uday and Qusay were killed in a firefight months later, and Saddam himself was captured in December 2003. The invasion ended his rule but unleashed years of instability, raising enduring questions about intelligence, power, and the consequences of preventive war, questions that continue to shape American foreign policy today.